Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? So, I am Eds de la Cruz, the Global Communications Coordinator of Indigenous Peoples Rights International. I will be serving as your today's moderator for the online forum Weaponizing the Law, Targeting the Defenders, Anti-Terror Law and Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to attend our online activity, and we hope that you will be able to know more about the topic and share insights afterwards so that we make a safe space to discuss the anti-terrorism law in the Philippines. So before we begin, a few reminders. First, make sure that you put your audio on mute and your video off. Kindly avoid making unnecessary noise to avoid interrupting the speakers. Third, we have 2 language channels. If you wish to listen to English, kindly use the English channel. And if you wish to listen in Filipino, kindly choose the Spanish channel. If you have questions or clarifications, you may post your questions on the Q&A section. There's a tab here in Zoom where you can put your questions. And lastly, we are also live on Facebook. So you may post your questions on the comment section in our Facebook page, Indigenous Peoples Rights International. That's facebook.com/IPRI Rights International, INTL, for our Facebook page. We will be also live on Twitter. Kindly follow our Twitter page, IPRI Rights International. So, as for our forum today, on July 3, while the Philippines was grappling with the horrors brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, President Rodrigo Duterte signed into law the controversial Republic Act 11479, or the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. The Anti-Terrorism Act has been met with so many criticisms by different human rights organizations, different civil society organizations in the Philippines. Today, let us know more about the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 and how it may further endanger the lives of Indigenous peoples and IP rights advocates in the Philippines. To begin, may I call on Bayan Muna Representative Eufemia Juliamat, a Monobo from Surigao del Sur, for a short opening message. Representative Eufemia.
Hi, hello. Magandang hapon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. Ang anti-terror law, no? Ang sabi ng ayon sa Kongreso at Malacanang ay ito raw ay pangontra ng ng terorismo, no? Pero sa akin bilang isang katutubo, ang anti-terror law ay mas malala pa ito kaysa martial law sa Mindanao nung ipinasa ang martial law sa Mindanao. Makikita natin na itong anti-terror law na talagang hindi siya ang epektibong tugon sa kinakaharap natin na problema.
That the anti-terror law is not an effective response to the problem of the Philippines? That the poor people of the Philippines have been suffering in hunger, and it has not been responded to by the government.
Nitong pagdating ng COVID-19, ito sana yung bigyang tuon ng
With the emergence of COVID-19,
konkretong plano para paano iligtas ang mamamayan laban sa COVID-19.
the government should have responded to the needs of the people in responding to the pandemic.
Nang nagsimula yung lockdown, na humingi ang Pangulo ng emergency power na naglabas ng batas na
The President has issued
Bayanihan to Hell as One Act para di umano tugunan ang maka-align ng mga budget para sa COVID-19. Tapos meron 275 billion na nilaan para di umano sa Social Amelioration Program sa 18,000 pamilyang Pilipino. Na ito ay tatanggapin ng mga mahihirap sa loob ng 2 buwan. At bawat buwan ay makakatanggap ang bawat pamilya ng 5,000 to 8,000 na halaga. Ngunit hanggang sa kasalukuyan, ang unang tranche ng SAF, ang unang buwan kumbaga, ay hindi pa tapos, hindi pa nakatanggap lahat. At yung pangalawang tranche ng Social Amelioration Program ay hindi pa rin, kasi simula pa lang, hindi pa rin aasahan natin na hindi rin yan makakatanggap ang lahat. Ibig sabihin, ito sana yung bigyang pansin ng gobyerno kung paano dahil lockdown, kailangan ng mamamayan na meron silang makakain sa kanilang bahay upang hindi nila malabag ang mga protocol na diniklara ng IETF. Ngunit dahil walang ayuda at naghahanap ng pagkain ang mga tao, naghihirap, kaya ang daming hinuhuli na lumalabag di umano sa protocol. No? Nangunguna ang sa panahon ng COVID, nangunguna ang kapangyarihan ng militar, no? Imbes na ang mangunguna sana ay ang mga health worker kasi sila yung may alam ano ang gagawin upang malabanan ang COVID. Sila ang may alam paano
instead of the health workers to respond into the crisis.
paggawa upang malabanan natin yung COVID. Ngunit dahil ang
But because government decided to respond wrongly to the pandemic, there were many complaints, especially from the indigenous people.
Komunidad, halimbawa mula Cordillera hanggang Mindanao, ang dumating sa mga komunidad ay mga pandigmang himpapawid at binumba ang mga komunidad batay na sa ating karanasan.
Indigenous people communities
palang may operasyon doon sa komunidad mismo na hindi nila inobserve ang health protocol na magsuot ng mask, may physical distancing, hindi nila yan inobserve. Nagbahay-bahay pa sila sa mga bahay at nanghuhuli doon sa mga komunidad. So ito yung sinasabi natin na ito yung pinangangambahan ng mga katutubo na itong Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 ay mas lalong lumalabag sa karapatan ng mamamayan na magpahayag sa kanilang saloobin na itong natin na hindi ito epektibong solusyon. At sa kasalukuyan, dahil nakikita ng Pangulo na ang daming nagreklamo sa ganitong kalagayan, kaya bilang katutubo, no, sa aking ang utang ngayon ng ating bansa ay umabot na ng 9 trillion mahigit, no. At ito yung talagang ginagamit ang anti-terror law, no, doon sa pagpapatahimik ng mga kritiko ng gobyerno, lalo na sa mga katutubo na matagal dang tumindig sa pagdepensa sa ating inang kalikasan dahil wala na silang ibang mapupuntahan. Wala na kaming ibang mapupuntahan kung masira pa ang ating kalikasan. Doon nagmula ang aming buhay. Na sa tingin namin, dahil sa ang laki-laki ng utang natin, ang utang ng Pilipinas, walang ibang maging collateral kundi ang mga lupaing ninuno natin. Kaya inaasahan namin ng mga katutubo ay mas lalo pa itong lumala ang aming kalagayan dahil hindi namin bibitiwan ang aming panindigan na kailangang depensahan ang ating inang kalikasan para sa kinabukasan ng ating susunod na henerasyon. At lalo na yung isang nakikita din namin na patuloy na nilalabag ang aming karapatan dahil doon sa aming inisyatiba sa pagpatayo ng paaralan para sa aming mga kabataan ay mas gustong isara lahat ang mga lumad na paaralan. Noon pang July 2019, sinimulang isira ang doon sa Davao Region ng mga paaralan at sa kasalukuyan ay yung sa Surigao del Sur, yung trips at sa Alcadib ay nandun ngayon yung presensya ng militar mag-isang taon na. Ngayong August 16, mag-isang taon na, nandun yung militar tapos sinabi nila na pagbubuksan yung paaralan ay huhulihin nila yung mga guro. Kaya marapat lamang na ilahad ang mga saluubin ng mga lumad galing sa Mindanao, dapat nagpapasalamat ako na ang dami nag-file ng petisyon. Parang 24 na yata ang naka-file na petisyon laban sa Anti-Terrorism Act. Kaya dapat lamang na tutulan natin ito dahil wala itong maidudulot na magandang kinabukasan sa bayan at lalo na sa ating mga mamamayan. Lamang po, maraming salamat at magandang hapon.
Thank you very much, Representative Colyamat.
Maraming salamat kay Representative Colyamat at narito pa ang isang pambungad na salita mula kay Brother Jose.
In the Philippines under the presidency of Benigno Aquino III. Brother Armin.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Malinaw ba?
Yes po.
Yes, okay. Isang malalim at marugdob na pagbati sa lahat ng ating mga kasamang katutubo. And from now on, I will speak in English. I think it will be better.
English na si.
Indigenous Peoples Day kahapon. At I'm very happy to join you.
Araw ng mga katutubo. Nasisihan siyang makilahok ngayon sa talakayan sa anti-terror law. Ngunit iniisip ko na hindi lang ito isang kilos ng kasalukuyang
and a pattern that has gone outside of our very experience as Filipinos. The anti-terror law is only one such action of the Duterte administration that has been pushing against our basic human rights. Alam po natin na ang ating mga katutubo ang may pagkilala sa tunay nating pagkatao bilang mga Pilipino. Yung ating kaluluwa, yung ating diwa bilang mga Pilipino ay natutunan natin at isinalin sa iba't ibang mga salinlahi ng ating mga kasamang katutubo. Wala po akong narinig sa ating mga kasamang katutubo dito sa Pilipinas na sumisiil sa mga karapatan ng kanyang mga nasasakupan. Kilala po ang mga Pilipino at lalong-lalo na ang ating mga katutubo sa pakikipagkapwa-tao. Ang lahat po natin na mga hindi pinagkakaayusan, mga away, ang hindi natin hindi pagkakaunawaan, ay atin pong pinag-uusapan. Ganyan po ang Pilipino. Hindi po tayo naniniil. Hindi po tayo nanggigipit sa ating kapwa. ang bawat isa ay kapwa. At ang ating pakikipagkapwa sa bawat isa ay isang likas na nakikita sa bawat Pilipino. Ito po ang nangyayari sa ating bansa ngayon. At ang pagpapakulong halimbawa kay Senator Laila De Lima, ang pagsasara ng ABS-CBN, ang pagpapatalsik kay Chief Justice Sereno, ang atake sa Rappler, at ang hindi maayos na pagbibigay ng ayuda sa iba't ibang mga sektor sa Pilipinas ngayong panahon ng pandemya. Ito po ay ilan lamang sa mga sunod-sunod na pagsira sa ating katutubong kinaalaman tungkol sa ating pagka-Pilipino.
Wisdom of selflessness.
Batas itong anti-terrorism law na nagbibigay sa atin ng
The anti-terrorism law
pangamba ng ating gobyerno ay hindi nalalaman at nadadama ang ating mga hinaing. Imbis na magmalasakit sa atin, ang nakikita natin ay patuloy na paniniil. At alam ko na damang-dama ng ating mga katutubo ang paniniil ng gobyerno lalong-lalo ngayon. Dahil ng mga nakalipas na
are what's lacking in the government. For the past decades,
lipunan, nagkaroon din ng paniniil ang ating mga pamilyang katutubo. Ito pong nangyayari ngayon ay isa na naman dagdag na pasakit sa ating mga kasamang katutubo. Ang isa pong napakalaking issue na kasama rin
but this
dito sa anti-terrorism law ay ang issue ng Kaliwa Dam. Kung saan
The
one of
other
the issues
issue-
right now in the anti-terror dam and terror bill is the Kaliwa Dam, where the people, the IP people in that area,
Dam, sila po ang mauuna na maisama dito sa terrorism na listahan ng ating gobyerno. Tayo mismo, kasama ang mga katutubo natin, ay siyang nagiging mga punteriya ng ating gobyerno tungkol sa mga batas na lalong nagpapasakit sa ating bayan. Tutol po ako at kami po ay nagsampa sa Supreme Court ng isang
the anti-terror bill. I am one of those who filed
terrorism law na ito. Ngunit, wag po nating titingnan ito na hindi kasama sa iba't iba pang mga sunod-sunod na pagpapahirap ng ating gobyerno. Hindi pa nga po natatapos at hindi pa nag-iinit ang anti-terrorism law. Gusto na naman nila magsampa ng death penalty. Wala po akong alam ng mga katutubo natin na nagsusulong ng pagpatay ng kapwa-tao.
it is against the IP wisdom to kill each other. We ask the government to look back on how the IP people look at the Filipino. Killing people is not part of the Filipino culture. What is true and what is the essence of a Filipino? What is being an IP in the Filipino among the Filipinos is pakikipagkapwa-tao or selflessness. It is not killing each other. The true freedom, the true justice is to help the indigenous people.
Maraming salamat, Brother Armin. Humihingi kami ng pangunawa sa ating mga tagapanood dahil sa mga channels. Pumunta po kayo sa Spanish para sa salin sa English.
Messages are Representative Kalyama raised a few good points on her message on how the government has apparently neglected pressing issues such as lack of government assistance, especially to those who have been severely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And instead, it focused on passing into law this anti-terrorism law. Brother Armin Luiso, on the other hand, mentioned several instances of repression in recent months, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. He mentioned the attacks against press freedom and against indigenous rights through the development of Kaliwa Dam. So at this point, let us discuss in details the anti-terrorism law and its implications to the indigenous rights and indigenous peoples in general. So may we call on our first speaker?
Ang ating unang
She is one of the indigenous leaders who co-signed
isa sa mga katutubo
the Supreme Court questioning the legality of the anti-terrorism law of 2020. Jenny Rose is a volunteer teacher of mathematics for Lumad Schools in Mindanao and is also a volunteer of Save Our Schools Network, a network of child rights advocates, organization, and various stakeholders working together to bring light and take action on the ongoing violation of children's right to education. Teacher Rose upholds that the setting of Lumad schools is not simply an assertion of youth's right to education, but an actual exercise of the indigenous people's right to self-determination. So this afternoon, we hear it from Jenny Rose Kayahay of Lumad Schools in Mindanao and Save Our Schools Network. Jenny Rose.
Yan.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Good day, everybody. So, again, I'm General Sayahay,
ako po si Teacher Rose.
teacher of Salugpungan. Yan. I am volunteer teacher of Salugpungan, Tano, Iganogon, Community Learning Center Incorporated, one of the Lumad schools in Mindanao. So, before anything else, let me first share you before passing of the anti-terror law. No? So before passing the anti-terror law, the Lumad communities and schools have been experiencing several attacks, and we are living evidence of the real reason of military presence. The real intent is not to protect the people, but to protect the capitalist corporation and the landlords. Since the assumed office of martial law or martial period and the open threat of the Lumad schools back in 2017. And with around 700 cases of attacks on our schools as of December 2017. These worsening attacks were forced evacuation, aerial bombings, forced and fake surrenders, forced recruitment, threats, destruction of schools, and around 54 individuals, including human rights defenders, school administrators, parents, teachers, faces fabricated charges, and not even single destructive mining
Hello. I think we lost Jenny Rose. Jenny Rose. Jenny Rose, can you hear us? Teacher Rose?
Hello.
Ayan. Okay.
Yes. Yes. So attack every 2 days, and it was worsened during the declaration of martial law period and the open threat of the president to bomb the Lumad schools, with around 700 cases of attacks on our schools as of December 2019. So these worsening attacks, forced evacuation, aerial bombing, fake
Sa pilitang pagbabakwit, sa pilitang pag-recruit, pananakot,
including human rights defenders, school administrators, teachers, parents, faces fabricated charges, and not even single destructive mining operations were closed in Mindanao, but there have been 176 Lumad schools forcibly closed as of May 2020. So disenfranchising not less than 8,000 Lumad students. So, according to the data of the Saver Schools Network, there are around 1,030 total incidents of attacks on schools with a total number of 93,977 victims. Distracting the environments and killing, among others, are the reason why we are still fighting back. And so even during the pandemic COVID-19, the state-sponsored attacks did not stop. The bombing of Lumad communities in Jatogan, Surigao City, in Davao de Oro, and even bombing in our ancestral land in Zamboanga del Sur, and shutting down one of the biggest Lumad school in Mindanao. This only
eskwelahan. Doon nagpapatunayan na ang prioridad ng gobyerno ay hindi ang pandemic, kundi
even before the passing of the anti-terror law and before pandemic, our schools labeled as terrorist schools, teachers labeled an NPA recruiter. Those are malicious, baseless, and recycled allegations, led by, of course, the National Task Force to End the Local Communist Conflict, AFP, used in shutting down 54 salubungan schools and another schools in Mindanao. So during the 3 months, Philippine country lockdown, we at the Saver Schools Network documented 16 incidents of threat, harassment, intimidation, victimizing 133 individuals. 4 cases of fake enforced surrender affecting 25 individuals, mostly our parents and teachers. 5 incidents of aerial bombings, 3 incidents of illegal arrests, victimizing 7 individuals. 2 incidents of forced evacuation, and one teacher presently faces trump-up charges. So by passing the anti-terror law, and anti-minorities, anti-people policy, it will only legitimize the killings, attacks, red tagging, and even calling Lumad communities, Lumad schools, teachers, parents, students, land defenders, human rights defenders, and the environmental activists as a member, supporter, or leftists, or even a terrorist. So we call to junk the terror law together with the national minorities. Last August 7, we filed a petition versus anti-terror law with the help of Attorney Lavinia. Then we call to the Supreme Court to immediately forbid its implementation. The fight of the national minorities, the fight of the Lumad for education and ancestral land is a fight for the environment. The fight to protect Pantaron is just like the fight to protect Sierra Madre and Amazon forest in fight for the planet. So let me quote the joint statement of the national minorities during the filing on Supreme Court last August 7, that the night may seem so long, but nobody, not even Duterte, cannot stop the dawn from rising. After all, we are indeed hopeless, we have those fears, but after all, hope is stronger than fear. We fought before, and we are still here. Good day.
Thank you very much, Jenny Rose, for that very
salamat, Jenny Rose.
discussion on the current plight of Indigenous peoples here in the Philippines, particularly in relation to Lumad schools. And one of the things that the Indigenous Peoples Rights International did for the World's Indigenous Peoples Day, we released a mid-year global report on the criminalization of and impunity against Indigenous peoples during COVID-19 pandemic. And it's very similar to what Jenny Rose has discussed. In fact, more than 110 or more than half or 110 of the 202 documented incidents are on criminalization of Indigenous peoples. And the Philippines is the highest is the country with the highest number of documented incidents at 32. So that's very similar to what Jenny Rose has discussed earlier about the different threats, attacks against different organizations, different indigenous leaders, and schools in Mindanao. So after Jenny Rose's discussion, we would like to call on Commissioner Gwendolyn Pimentel Gana. She is the focal commissioner of the policy of the Commission on Human Rights. She is currently active in looking into the concerns of indigenous peoples through the establishment of IP Observatory and National Inquiry on their situation. As the focal for migrant workers, she is also spearheading the establishment of Migrant Workers Observatory to systematically monitor the situation of overseas Filipinos workers abroad. So Commissioner Pimentel Gana is a lawyer and has a bachelor's degree in international studies at Maryknoll College or Miriam College today. May we call on Commissioner Gwendolyn Pimentel Gana.
Thank you, Eds. Good afternoon. May hapon kaninyo tanan. I would like to greet everyone a belated Happy International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which was yesterday, according to Brother Armin. And allow me also to extend my warmest congratulations to Global Directors Vicky Tauli Corpus and Joanne Carling and their colleagues for the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. I am going to discuss this afternoon how the ATL affects the human rights and fundamental freedoms of indigenous peoples. 13 years ago, vast majority of UN member states numbering 144 voted to pass a very important document that is now known as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UNDRIP. The UNDRIP declares several rights of the indigenous peoples as individuals and as a collective group. Among them are the right to land, territories, resources, which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. 2, the right to self-determination, which includes the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And 3, the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs. And 4, the right to enjoy and practice their cultures and customs, religions, their languages, and to develop and strengthen their economies and their social and political institutions. In the country, these rights are recognized no less than by our Constitution and by a domestic law, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Globally and locally, we see some advances in the fulfillment of these rights, although we also witness the many challenges preventing their realization, including violence against indigenous peoples who are asserting these rights and their continued dispossession of their lands. In the Philippines, concerns were raised by various groups over the enactment of the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020, or ATL. Indigenous individuals and indigenous communities ask, what is the impact of the law on their rights declared under the UNDRIP? Excuse me, Eds, I was wondering, I have a PowerPoint presentation, but it's not coming up on the screen.
I'll ask assistance from our IT po. Sige po.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just continue. Okay, I'll just continue. Okay. The law has direct effect on the indigenous people's human rights and fundamental freedoms declared in Article 1 of the UNDRIP. The exercise of these human rights and freedoms are important means to assert and protect the other rights, like the right to land and territories, the right to self-determination, the right to self-governance, and the right to enjoy and practice their cultures, customs, their religions, and their languages. Among the major flaws of the ATL lies in the broad and vague definition of terrorism. Section 4 of the Anti-Terrorism Bill defines terrorism. Said definition, I believe, will later be discussed in detail by Professor Lavinia. But allow me to say, however, that a comparison of the definition with that of the Human Security Act of 2007 readily reveals the vagueness of the definition of in the ATL law of terrorism. HSA requires that the prohibited acts must constitute serious crimes clearly defined by the revised penal code and other penal laws, such as piracy, rebellion, insurrection, coup d'etat, murder, kidnapping, and serious illegal detention, and other crimes punished under special penal laws. The intent under the Human Security Act is limited to sowing and creating a condition of widespread and extraordinary fear and panic among the populace, and also in order to coerce the government to give in to an unlawful demand. This is in contrast to the many purposes found under the ATL. In 2010, Martin Schneinin, Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, while countering terrorism, developed a model definition which complies with human rights and or promotes enjoyment of fundamental freedoms and effective combating of terrorism. According to him, anything that goes beyond the model definition is problematic from a human rights perspective. The definition of terrorism in the present law goes beyond the model definition. Apart from engaging in acts intended to cause death or serious injury to any person, the anti-terrorism law includes acts that endanger a person's life, very broad, no? Cause extensive damage or destruction to a government or public facility, public place, or private property, and 3, cause extensive interference with damage or destruction to critical infrastructure. Now, the law likewise included ambiguous intents, like example, to provoke the government or international organization to seriously destabilize or destroy the fundamental political, economic, social structures of the country, and 3, seriously undermine public safety. It's all very vague and general. It also deleted the specific crimes that would have complied with the specific requirement that the act corresponds to a serious offense defined by our law. The indigenous peoples' territories are the last remaining resource-rich lands, and many of these areas attract state-facilitated development projects, either by private entities or even by government. In not a few instances, these are brought to ancestral domains without the free, prior, and informed consent of the community owning them. If the communities organize themselves and stand up against the project, should the acts of organizing and standing up be considered endangering persons' lives, as they may face the state's law enforcers and other armed forces guarding the projects? Should the acts of organizing and standing up against the project be interpreted to have the intent of provoking the government or seriously undermining public safety? To our understanding, these are not terrorist acts, but under the new law, it appears that these acts may qualify as acts of terrorism. The UN DRIP recognizes the indigenous people's right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs. If indigenous communities exercise this right and refuse interference by government in matters internal to them, should this act be considered seriously destabilizing or destroying the fundamental political structures of the country as to constitute a terrorist act? From the definition of the new law, they may be considered terrorist acts. Without a doubt, the vagueness of what constitutes terrorist acts, threats or to commit or to incite or to commit acts of terrorism and other identified crimes violate the basic right to due process as it gives no fair notice of what specific acts are to be avoided. Worse, the definition also leaves to law enforcers wide and unbridled discretion to interpret the provisions of the law, and as a consequence, the vagueness will open the floodgates to abuse and misuse, targeting dissenters, critics of the government, civil society organizations, human rights defenders, journalists, minority groups, labor activists, and the indigenous people, as of course was discussed by our previous speaker, Rolf Hayahai. From the foregoing, it can be safely stated that any exercise of the rights of freedom of expression, of speech, right to assembly, and other rights and fundamental freedoms pertaining to the assertion of indigenous rights under the UN DRIP and domestic laws can be considered acts of terrorism, threat to commit terrorism, or inciting to commit terrorism. The people or group of persons or association exercising any of these rights can be a suspect and can be the subject of surveillance, number one, of a maximum of 60 days, which is longer than the 30 days in the Human Security Act of 2007. By designation, by probable cause as terrorists by the Anti-Terrorism Council, which is an executive body. And of course, akin to this, Vicky, our special rapporteur, was already subjected to being tagged as a communist or as a terrorist for that matter. And proscription and detention without judicial warrant for a maximum of 24 days. These circumstances prevent the free exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms. As human rights and fundamental freedoms are also means to assert indigenous peoples' rights, their suppression and violation will likely result to the disregard or violation of indigenous peoples' rights. So it is very clear to the CHR that terrorist acts undermine the rights to life, liberty, and security of every human person. But states have to establish measures to prevent and counter terrorist acts. In fact, immediately after the 2001 terror attacks in the US, the UN Security Council in Resolution 1373 adopted a resolution obliging member states to criminalize terrorist acts, and they should be considered serious criminal offenses in domestic laws. It has likewise obliged states to suppress financing terrorist acts, freeze funds, and financial assets of persons who commit or attempt to commit terrorist acts. However, these measures must promote and protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of all, including those of the indigenous people. This is very clear in several UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. The ATL law of 2020, which is a compliance to resolution number 1373 of the UN, falls short in promoting and protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Hence, the CHR will add its voice to the discourse in the Supreme Court this month. As the National Human Rights Institute of the country, the CHR shall continue acting as an independent body to monitor possible abuses of the law and violations of human rights, and will call the attention of the government when abuses and violations are found to have been committed. Should there be a finding of abuse or violation, the CHR shall refer the filing of the appropriate cases before the proper forum. To note, the ATL removed the prosecutorial authority of the CHR under the HSA to file cases for violation of the ATL. We also see wide information dissemination to be important to inform the public, especially the vulnerable groups, including indigenous peoples, of the role of the CHR in promoting and protecting human rights while countering terrorism. The CHR will further broaden its collaboration with government, civil society, vulnerable groups, and indigenous peoples in the protection of human rights while countering terrorism. Complainants who may fear for their lives may likewise avail of the witness protection programs of the CHR, and for those who cannot hire lawyers, legal assistance may be provided, and financial assistance may also be extended to them. In conclusion, in his 2006 report titled United Against Terrorism, Recommendations for a Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said, "Effective counter-terrorism measures and the protection of human rights are not conflicting goals, but complementary and mutually reinforcing ones. Accordingly, the defense of human rights is essential to the fulfillment of all aspects of a counter-terrorism strategy. In the same manner, that effective counter-terrorism measures are not meant to suppress indigenous people's rights, but are additional mechanisms that help promote and protect said rights." Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to the organizers, and God bless everyone. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Gwen. Thank you for clarifying the legal implications of anti-terrorism law, not only to indigenous rights, indigenous peoples, but to human rights in general. And indeed, the passage and now the implementation of Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is truly alarming, as it undermines, as you mentioned, as it undermines the Filipinos' right to life. And in essence, similar to what Commissioner Gwen mentioned, laws should uphold and promote the fundamental freedoms and rights of all, including the indigenous peoples. However, this may not be the case for the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. To discuss the petition filed by the indigenous peoples organizations in the Philippines to the Supreme Court questioning the validity of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, may I call on Attorney Tony Lavinia. Attorney Tony Lavinia is a Filipino lawyer, educator, and environmental policy expert. He was a former Undersecretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR. He was also a former dean of the Ateneo School of Government at Ateneo de Manila University, and he currently teaches law, governance, and philosophy in the Ateneo de Manila University, University of the Philippines, De La Salle University, Xavier University, San Beda University, Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Lyceum of the Philippines, Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila, among others. So may we call on again, Attorney Tony Lavinia.
Thank you, Eds, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Commissioner Gwen, Brother Armin, if you're still around, of course, Teacher Rose, Congresswoman Euphemia. Magandang hapon, I'm happy to be here. This afternoon, I think Teacher Rose did already mention the filing that we did of the petition to declare the anti-terror law unconstitutional. I'll share my screen now to explain a little bit what the case is all about. In essence, we frame this petition around its impact, the impact of the anti-terror law to indigenous peoples, to Bangsamoro people, and because they're quite similar also, by extension also to land and environmental and human rights defenders. By the way, before I forget, I think it's very important for us to recognize that one of the peacemakers of this country, Randy Achanis, was killed this morning. I don't know the circumstances yet, so I'm not gonna blame anyone. But for sure, this was an extrajudicial killing, a blow against peace. And this is exactly what we think will happen with an anti-terror law that, as I think Commissioner Gwen has rightly described, is very, very big and can be used against anyone. We have to understand that the anti-terror law that was enacted, you see the timeline in which it was done in the screen. This law has to be understood in the context of the current situation where there's a lot of impunity for killings already, extrajudicial killings. So what the law does is to add to this sense of siege, this sense of fear, this threat to people that are only really asserting their rights. Now you might ask, what is the special vulnerability of indigenous and Moro peoples in this with this law? By the way, we were the 24th officially petitioner. Although by the time we know there were 26 petitions already. So by the two petitions, and I'm glad that the two petitions that are from Mindanao, directly from Mindanao, they mailed it from Davao and I suppose from Zamboanga or from Basilan. And then we were the officially 24th, but as far as the 26th. And today another petition was filed by various media organizations and the faculty of the Lyceum College of Law. I mean, where I also teach. Just a little bit of aside. Theoretically speaking, and in this case led by two retired justices that graduated from UP Law, Justice Tony Carpio and Justice Carpio Morales. And then FLAG also, Free Legal Assistance Group, filed its own petition, and I'm a member of the Free Legal Assistance Group. The FEU Law Faculty filed, led by our Dean, Dean Mel Santa Maria, and I would have joined that as well. And then the concerned lawyers for civil liberties, led by VP Binay and Senator Sagisag. I'm also a member and convener of that. I could have done that. But I decided to focus on being a lawyer and instead of petitioner for Indigenous and Moro peoples, because precisely I realized that they have very serious threats against them because of this. And frankly, while I'm all often described as an environmental lawyer, as an environmental expert, my an Indigenous people's rights lawyer first, an environmental lawyer second, because I arrive at environmental. I mean, I talk about that not in terms of priority. I think it's important to defend the planet as important to defend peoples. But I did arrive at defending the planet by first defending peoples, because that was one of my that's what I specialized in after law school. In fact, during law school itself, co-founding a group called Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center, which is our my partner here in terms of the law part of being counsels to the various groups that filed this case. No? I always say a case like that takes a village. I mean, so we actually have several groups that were part of this. As I said, for the law part, it's the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center. But several groups and individuals, and just a short background, just to see you the breadth. This is just to show you the breadth of. This is to show you the breadth of the petitioners that we have in this case. No, I mean, we have Beverly Longid, who's the International Solidarity Officer of Catribo. So Catribo was our partner in an organization, and Beverly was actually charged, and that has been dismissed already in the prescription case against the Communist Party under the Human Security Act. We have Samira Gutok from Marawi, senatorial candidate, chairperson of Ako Bakwit, because the Muslims, Moros, have been targeted. They have legitimate demands. It's all legitimate. It's all above board, all legal, but they have been targeted, accused of being anti-government, or being too critical of government, or even being terrorists. No, you have Joanna Carino of Sandugo Alliance. Name was one of the leaders of the CPP-NPA in the prescription case I mentioned, which was dismissed. And that's very important. It's one of the major things that we say here. The prescription case caused a lot of, and I think that was mentioned earlier also by Gwen, caused a lot of stress, fear, intimidation among peoples. Clearly based on faulty intelligence. Eventually, most of them were dismissed. The cases were dismissed. Only 2 people remain charged as of now because there's just no evidence. And now you have a new anti-terror law that gives the government even more power. So we have also Amira Lidasan of the Moro Christian Peoples Alliance, Lorena Bayao of Sabocan in Davao del Norte, one of the indigenous peoples there. We had Chad Boak of Alcadev. We have Teachers Rose of the Save Our Schools earlier. We have Judy Pasimio. We have Teresa, it's very important also. We have Teresa Linding, chairperson of the Moro Consensus Group. and Teresa de la Cruz, an ETA woman leader. So we have all of this range. Why would all of these people, why would all of them actually be filing the case? Now, what unites them? Well, they're all members of I groups, Moro groups. They all work for legitimate organizations, invoking international law in their favor. The UNDRIP mentioned also earlier the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, invoking, in some cases, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, invoking the 1987 Constitution provisions on human rights and on indigenous people rights. Yet they feel that this law threatened. I mean, and briefly to go to where the framing of this, well, we see the threat that the passage of this law brings to our clients. So they share the commonality of interests and experiences. They've been victims of red tagging or red baiting or imputations of terrorism at various levels numerous times, even without this law. But with this law, thank God there's the judiciary, right? Because when the case was filed, clearly there was no evidence, and eventually, as the judiciary and the judge in that case went through it, those cases were dismissed, as they had to be dismissed. But now what do we have under Section 4 in relation to actually other sections of the law? I mean, what it does now is to, with very vague definitions of what is covered and not covered, these indigenous peoples and Moro peoples and their leaders are once again threatened. The vague definitions, it would appear, covers actions and advocacies vulnerable to being classified as acts of terrorism. Even humanitarian activities, if there's an evacuation, we know that. If you work with indigenous peoples, it happens all the time. They have to evacuate they get caught in between social conflict, violent conflict. Sometimes they're forced to evacuate by people interested in their lands, mining companies, whatever private companies might want to drive them away from their land. And so they go to cities and there are evacuees there, and you want to help them. You can now even be charged for supporting terrorism for that. I mean, later on, if there's a chance, I will go to the various provisions in RA 11479 that threatens the right of indigenous peoples to assert their rights, to protect themselves, for others to support them, and finally, very important here, the right to self-determination. I think Commissioner Gwen also mentioned that. And the right to self-determination includes the right to be secure in your homeland, to be secure in your territory. So exactly, you can practice that. You can actually be faithful to what you as a community, as a people want, and what this and we have that in our constitution. There's nothing strange about that. I mean, but now under this law, because it brings this insecurity to the communities and to the peoples, it could be very, very problematic. No? Even before this law, we heard the president say about using our armed forces to bomb Lumad territory in Mindanao, including the schools. I mean, there, and with this law, there could be a signal to be even do even more. No? So I will end there because there'll be a chance to elaborate further. The most vulnerable people, honestly, people have asked me, don't you feel scared yourself? Yes, and I'm a lawyer. I have a PhD. I teach in 14 law schools, right? I am in several committees in Supreme Court. I work with government, all levels of, even up to now, I work with government when they ask me to do specific things in my expertise, like climate change. I mean, I don't hesitate to do that, but I still feel afraid because, like, even saying something like this can be seen as inciting to terrorism. Even I say expressly, I am for nonviolent change in government. I am for the use of the word, the use of the law to change things. I mean, but still, this new law can target me. But you know, I have lawyer friends. I have, you know, I have resources if I'm arrested. You know, but it's this indigenous peoples. It's this Moro peoples. It's this people, these teachers in the Lumad schools. They're the ones that are actually the most vulnerable here and the one that most need your help, especially internationally as well. So I'll end up, and if I have a chance later, I'll talk as well about other provisions of the law that are more technical.
Thank you very much, Attorney Tony Lavinia. Okay, one point that you raised earlier is that extrajudicial killings and even other forms of human rights violations have already been happening in the Philippines prior to this enactment of the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020. And so it is logical to actually fear or expect the worst now that we have this kind of law implemented in the country. So right now, we are giving our audience the opportunity to ask their questions to our panel of speakers. First is from Sabrina de los Reyes. I will read the question. With the state of our country's socio-political climate alongside ongoing issues from other countries on top of this global pandemic, does UN intervention even hold any sort of power to hold accountable and set any sort of charges against any unjust government like the Philippines? Attorney Tony Lavinia, Commissioner Gwen, and Teacher Rose.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
With the state of our country's socio-political climate alongside ongoing issues from other countries on top of this global pandemic, essentially, does the UN intervention even hold any sort of power to hold the Philippine government accountable?
Maybe Commissioner Gwen, you can start. Nakamute ka, Gwen.
Nakamute po.
Okay.
Ayan.
Sorry. Of course, you know, we are a party to a lot of conventions in the United Nations, and we have actually committed that we are part of a community of nations, you know. And of course, we expect that the government will abide with whatever mechanisms there is in the UN that people can go and complain. And yet, we have already seen how government actually reacted to this. You know, complaints were filed in the United Nations, but what did the government do? Like example, withdrawing from the Rome Statute and things like that. But of course, they can do and make do of the UN mechanisms. However, in reality and in practicality, the government will have a say on whether or not they will comply with what the United Nations will say. But of course, we should never stop in speaking truth to power. Just go on and continue. And maybe they will listen later on. And international pressure, you know, is different also. So they might just feel the pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gwen. Attorney Tony.
Yes, you know, just to emphasize the power of international pressure. I mean, there was a report prepared by the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights in last April, right? And it's presented to the Human Rights Council. The government responded to that, both in terms of the written report as well as the sending, this again by Zoom, like this one. But it was Justice Guevara himself, and actually responded by saying, "We will have." You know, you might be cynical about it. I try not to be cynical, regardless of what happened. I mean, because that's the only way you can make sense, especially as a lawyer, to push things forward. But it made the government actually create a committee to study nanlaban extrajudicial killings and make a promise. And we can be cynical that they're doing it only to avoid a case in the International Criminal Court. Indigenous peoples are particularly important. I mean, because when you target indigenous peoples, it becomes genocide, right? It's not just crimes against humanity. When you target the Moro people, Bangsamoro people, it becomes genocide. As distinguished, which is easier, by the way, to prove than crimes against humanity. Because crimes against humanity, you have to prove a systematic attack on a group of people, a group of individuals. But when you're attacking indigenous peoples like the Lumad or the people of the Cordillera or Bangsamoro people, then you can show that in fact that is a crime, an international crime called genocide, and there's the government would have to respond to that, whether or not we're members of the International Criminal Court Treaty or not. No. So this has value for us. I mean, and our international colleagues, I know many are listening from all over the world. Do be vocal about this in every way that you can, because it matters to your brothers and sisters in indigenous peoples in the Philippines and other vulnerable groups that other groups internationally are supporting them.
Thank you, Attorney Tony. Teacher Rose, do you have anything to add on their answers?
Yes. How can we hold the accountability, of the state-sponsored attack? Of course, we should call for the international solidarity to pressure the Philippine governments to urge, to call for justice, and of course, mass the people. Yes. Then, actually, in this kind of situation that we have been experiencing since last year, since Duterte assumed, we fought before, and we are still here today. So yeah, and we are asking for international people, organization, government to urge the government and hold them accountable.
Thank you, Teacher Rose. In relation to your answer, I would like to ask, what would be the next step? I mean, given that you and other indigenous peoples organizations have already filed the petition, what would be the next steps for indigenous peoples' rights organizations like Save Our Schools Network, Salumpungan?
We should continue to appeal to the government to reopen the Lumad schools, of course, for the Lumad students to not to stop their education, and we keep on connecting with other organization individuals, and to brainstorm of what we should do in legal and defensive or offensive battles.
Attorney Tony and Commissioner Gwen, same question. What will be the next steps? For instance, for lawyers like Attorney Tony Lavinia, and from the government arm, Commissioner Gwen, what would be the next steps in terms of the implementation of this Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is pending right now? So do you have any plans? Do you have any activities or of some sorts?
Yes. Obviously, first the laws, the petitions rather, right? We have the petitions that are now in the Supreme Court, and we have to wait for that. I hope they will issue a temporary restraining order. That's what we're waiting for. I suppose they'll talk about this on Tuesday, tomorrow, or maybe we'll wait another week for other petitions to come in. I don't know. I have no knowledge of what the Supreme Court internally will proceed, but that's our hope. And then there'll probably be oral arguments, and we have to mobilize around the oral arguments to show that society is upset about this and doesn't want this law to be done. So that's the legal side. On the legislative side, I think it's very important to start working on repealing the law. I always said that the day this is passed, you start working on it for its repeal, and you start working for an alternative. And then let's be very clear. I mean, I'll be very clear about this, and I've always been I've always been clear about this. I'm not. I am definitely for good approaches and effective approaches to fighting terrorism. Commissioner Gwen and I, Teacher Rose, Congressman Eufemia, we're all from Mindanao. And I mean, and Commissioner Gwen and I in particular are well, even those in Davao. You know, I mean, we've seen terrorist attacks that kill innocent people, right? Bombs in the middle of in churches, bombs in the middle of in the middle of a park, you know, Marawi being taken over in a siege. So it's not like we support terrorism, and I expressly say that I am against terrorism. Rightly defined, the right definition of terrorism is killing, assassination, to cause chaos, you know, without really a clear reason for doing so. I mean, and that has to be distinguished, for example, with revolutionary violence, for example, of the MNLF before, or the MLF before, or the NPA, where you can actually negotiate a peace agreement with them. But with terrorists, I agree, you cannot negotiate with terrorists because their intent is to destroy you completely and to destroy society completely. So we have to have an alternative to that law. It doesn't have to be draconian, quite honestly. I think even the Human Security Act is already too draconian for me. Because in the end, what do you actually need? You need good investigation and good prosecution. That's what you have to invest in to fight terrorism. So the legislative work also has to be done to be able to deal with that. And then for us individuals, for the people, we have to assert ourselves. I mean, not to be afraid, not to be intimidated. And I think it's very important to not be intimidated by the threat that you will be charged as a terrorist if you're critical of the government. Particularly during this time in a pandemic, when in fact government makes mistakes, and it's important for us to have a discussion on how best to address this pandemic, right? Thank you.
Attorney Gwen, Commissioner Gwen, sorry.
Oh, I fully agree with what Dean Tony said, and there are many ways in which we can move forward. Well, for one, when it comes to the petition in the Supreme Court, we, Dean Tony, we intend to file an amicus brief with leave of court, no? And we're just waiting for the other petitions to come in. And then we're going to file the amicus brief with leave of court, of course. And I fully am agreeable with the next steps that Dean Tony was saying in terms of legislative action, what should we do, and even as individuals, no? And we, as the Commission on Human Rights, we have the mandate to monitor the implementation. And we are sure to investigate any other abuses that will come along in the implementation of this ATL. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gwen. Another question for the three of you. Since the implementation of the anti-terrorism law, the risk of being tagged as a terrorist is really high. Everyone can be a victim. So what do we do if we are falsely claimed of being a terrorist? So they're asking for tips. Commissioner Gwen and Attorney Tony.
Sure.
Well, of course. Sige, so Attorney
Gwen, go first.
Oh, sige. We in the Commission on Human Rights, our offices are of course open, no? And we can you can run to us, and we can give you. We have a QRT, the Quick Reaction Team, that would go to where the person has been picked up and detained, and we can assist them. And of course, we are working with different law groups, like even I think organization yata ni Dean Tony, your part, we are an MOU with the lawyers groups, and of course we refer this because we're not really the first responders, but you can come to us and we will be able to assist you in investigation and laying the groundwork for cases to be filed. Thank you.
To answer that, I'm thinking I'll just show you something about what the threats are. And I mean, to people so we can actually see. I want to see how to put this as the full thing. Can you see the screen? You see that those are the crimes that can be charged. I mean, for those who commit commit terrorism under the under the under this law. Most likely, Section 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12 are the ones which are problematic for legitimate groups. No? So you have to know, in fact, what this consists of. And that's a problem right now because these are just one-line provisions. I'm just to give you a sample, for example, of those provisions. I mean, that are covered by this. I mean, you have, for example, recruitment to a membership in a terrorist organization. What if you're just recruiting a person to be part of an activist organization? Is that terrorism? The problem of inciting to terrorism. All of these are legitimate protests, legitimate acts, constitutional acts that you can do, but without knowing what in fact the crime is, you might end up doing that. I mean, so very important to me actually that we study among ourselves and see how we can continue to express ourselves in this setting that we now have, but without falling into this possibility, which is not easy because precisely of the vagueness of the law, and that's why hopefully the Supreme Court will declare it unconstitutional. I mean, I always say, by the way, to be fair, the law actually says na kung legitimate dissent, di ba? Kung exercise of constitutional rights, hindi siya pwedeng stop. It will not be under the anti-terror law. And that's very, very clear. Unfortunately, the law also says that there's an exception to this exception, which is that if that act that you have can create disorder, can lead to violence to a person or an office, then it will be terrorism. And that's why you have to be very careful about that. So concretely, you might want to have like a seminar among yourselves on what you think is allowable, not allowable, or everything is allowable, but what's dangerous and not dangerous. So you can at least know, no? Of course, you have to have lawyers to go to, especially if you're arrested, because the one other big areas, and let me share that also, again, that's really problematic in this law are the provisions on surveillance, interception, and recording, the provisions on detention without the warrant of arrest that allows you to be detained for 24 hours, even without charges being filed against you. And it's another big area of the law which should be declared unconstitutional because it's judicial. It is judicial usurpation. So my point is, you would need to have lawyers to do that, and we have to be vigilant so that, in fact, people are not detained illegally because of this law.
Thank you very much. There are still two questions from our audience. This is from Carl Salvador. What do you think the structure of this anti-terrorism bill could bring peace and security in our indigenous peoples? Perhaps, is there any part of the law, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, that could possibly bring peace and security to the indigenous peoples?
there is one provision in that law that says that the government recognizes that terrorism comes from legitimate grievances, social conflict, roots, poverty, discrimination, etc. And so that's good, because that in fact is a solution to terrorism or armed violence, the armed struggle against the government for change. The solution actually is not fighting them, because you really won't be able to finish that. We've seen that. I've been doing this for 40 years already, and it doesn't work. What works is solving the roots of injustice, the roots of terrorism, and there's a provision in the law that says that. But I want to answer the question also of, but does this law in fact solve terrorism? And the answer is no, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't. Among others, because this law I always say this, I mean, under the Human Security Act and before that, the universe of terrorists in the Philippines was much smaller. Diba? The real terrorists, the 1,000 people, the 2,000 people that might actually be terrorists in some form or another, that are really part of groups that are throwing bombs and assassinating people, kidnapping people to create chaos and intimidate people. That's the real definition of terrorism. And there's not too many of that in the Philippines, but they're dangerous. So that's why you have to go after them, right? But with this law, there's now tens of thousands of us, hundreds of thousands of us. Can now be covered by this law. Indigenous peoples leaders and Moro peoples leaders that are legitimately complaining about ancestral domain violations, about violations of their right to return to their homes in Marawi, and against mining companies or other activities that are harming them, are now part of what may be investigated for terrorism. That's your recipe for failure. You will really fail, because now you don't have enough investigators to investigate hundreds of thousands. So I think that the terrorists are probably happy with this law, but now they can hide among the tens of thousands of dissenters. And this country, let's be very clear, this country has a history of dissent. Even a history of rebellion, if you ask me, from way back to the Spanish times. And it has continued on because we have not resolved our social conflicts. In fact, when a pandemic like this happens, the inequality and the injustice is so apparent, right, that in fact, if you're a man of goodwill and a person of goodwill, you have to encourage dissent at this time.
Thank you very much, Attorney Tony. Commissioner Gwen, do you want to add anything on his answer? Last question from Jan Daniel Santillan. Is there a possibility of UN peacekeeping assistance or some sort of mitigation mechanisms in response to the state-sponsored attacks? I think Commissioner Gwen could share some insights on that.
State-sponsored attacks, meaning, are we talking of like EJK?
Yes, I think, yeah.
Or saying that it's state-sponsored. Of course, there are so many UN mechanisms. No, we can see that, like example, we can always go to a special rapporteur and the other UN mechanisms there is. It's like Tony is saying, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights can actually come up with advisories and calling the attention of government, and this is what just happened by the Security Council. So there are so many UN mechanisms, no, that can actually call and look into what's happening in our country. And I think it's very important, as we discussed earlier, that we should continue calling on the international community to look into what's happening in the Philippines, actually, So we must not lose hope, and we should continue to make use of the different mechanisms available to us in the international community. And you can actually go through the Commission on Human Rights for doing that.
Thank you, Commissioner Gwen. And perhaps we still have less than 5 minutes here in the forum. I would like to ask our panelists to give us a parting message on our discussion today. Maybe start with you, Commissioner Gwen.
Well, I'm very happy with our partners in the Indigenous Peoples organizations now, because you are very, actually, you are so knowledgeable of your rights that you are always standing up for them. And I think we should continue to do that. And we are partners with the Commission on Human Rights. We have an observatory that we've actually put up, Human Rights Observatory on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And we collect data from both the government and the civil society partners that we have. And we are actually coming up with studies from those data, advisories and legislative agenda would be drawn from there in order to support our Indigenous peoples. So just know that we are your partners, and let's work together so that we can protect and promote the rights of the Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gwen. Attorney Tony?
Yes. I just want to say three things. I mean, and they're all words of hope. And the first thing is I want to say how proud I am of our petitioners. By the way, they are mostly women. Ang tapang nila. They're so courageous, I have to tell you, knowing the risk that they take in just taking this action. I mean, and that's the word of hope there is we have to be courageous in these times. I mean, and not flinch, not cower. We have to be actually courageous. Second, unity is important. When I was first approached by our first clients here, the first thing I asked them was the willingness to have other petitioners of different groups and different organizations and different ethnicities. No? I wanted to suggested, and they all agreed that we framed this as a Moro and Indigenous Peoples alliance against terrorism by the state. Because here unity is important when you are defending human rights. That's really paramount, because human rights violators would seek to divide you and would attack you and isolate you, and that's that you must not accept. So number two, word of hope: united, we can do better. United, we can actually defeat enemies of human rights. The third word is actually hope itself. I mean, nothing remains the same, whether in this country or elsewhere. You know, I have been an Indigenous people's rights lawyer for 30 years, a human rights activist for 40 years, because I started way back when I finished college, and I'm having my 40th anniversary out of college already this year. So many years. And in this country and in the world, I've also been involved in lots of struggles in the world. There was very little Indigenous people's right to speak about 30 years ago, or certainly 40 years ago. Now we have a United Nations declaration on our side. Now we have a Philippine law on our side. No? So in other words, what I'm saying is things evolve. At the same time, it's never linear. It's not like you're always getting better and getting better. You can actually fall back and can get worse for a while. But this will get better. What I'm saying is what we now have in the Philippines and in the world will get better over time. And when it gets better, we make sure to take advantage of that and to accelerate progress on our issues as fast as possible. Because then it will get worse again, right? So, but if you're united and you're courageous, then when it gets better, you will get a lot of things done.
Thank you very much, Attorney Tony. Teacher Rose, any message?
And first of all, thank you. Daghan kaayong salamat. Thank you very much for the organizer of this event, the partner organization, especially Attorney Tony Lavinia and Commissioner Gwendoline. Thank you for this kind of opportunity no, na makapag-share ako as sa lumang situation in Mindanao. Then, we fought before and we are still here. No? Lumalaban pa rin tayo. Yan, sa lugpungan, we should unite and together let us uphold national minorities' right to self-determination. Daghang salamat.
Thank you very much, Teacher Rose, Commissioner Gwen, and Attorney Tony Lavinia for a very insightful discussion on the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. It is indeed a very challenging time for Indigenous peoples movement and for the rest of human rights defenders globally, including the Philippines. And we would like to thank everyone for listening, for joining us today. And we hope that we were able to raise consciousness on the fight of the Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. And as part of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, IPRI is committed, of course, to amplify the voices of the Indigenous peoples globally. And given that we will be having another set of discussions tomorrow and on August 12, we will continue creating more safe spaces on discussions of the plight of Indigenous peoples in the world. So join us again tomorrow for the discussion on the criminalization of and impunity against Indigenous peoples in the context of Asia and Africa. So we will be posting the details of our activity tomorrow in our Facebook page. Kindly follow or like our page, Indigenous Peoples' Rights International at IPRI International, and also on Twitter. We are at Indigenous Rights International. So maraming salamat po ulit. Maraming salamat Attorney Tony Lavinia, Commissioner Gwen, and Teacher Rose, and to everyone who joined us this afternoon. And we really hope that we were able to create this space to discuss and learn more about the issues, the dangers of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. Thank you very much.